On the American frontier, one mistake could cost you your freedom or your life. In the winter of 1873, in a quiet stretch of prairie far from any town, a young woman named Clara Whitmore lived alone in a small wooden cabin. Life on the frontier demanded courage. There were no neighbors for miles, no sheriff nearby when danger came, and no one to hear you if you screamed. Most nights were quiet, but one stormy night changed everything. Just after midnight, as the wind rattled the cabin walls and rain hammered the roof, Clara heard something that made her freeze beside the lantern. A knock, not a polite knock, a desperate one. When she opened the door, a man collapsed into her arms, bleeding, exhausted, and barely conscious. He wore a black coat soaked with rain, and a gun belt that told Clara exactly who he was. An outlaw, a wanted man. Helping him could mean prison, or worse, but leaving him outside meant certain death. So Clara made a choice that would soon place her directly in the path of the law. Because at sunrise, the sheriff himself rode up to her cabin. And before Clara could say a word, he looked straight at her and said, "I know he's inside. Now here's the question I want you to think about. If you were in Clara's place, would you hide the outlaw or turn him over to the law? Let me know what you'd do in the comments." Because Clara Whitmore's decision that morning would change 3 lives forever. In the early 1870s, life on the American frontier was not for the faint of heart. The land was vast and beautiful, but it was also unforgiving. Winters were harsh, storms came without warning, and the nearest town could be half a day's ride away. People who chose to live in such places did so because they valued independence above all else. Clara Whitmore was one of those people. At 24 years old, Clara had already seen more hardship than most women her age. 5 years earlier, she had traveled west with her parents in a wagon train from Missouri. Like many families after the Civil War, they hoped the frontier would offer a fresh start. But the frontier had its own rules. 2 years after arriving in the Wyoming Territory, Clara's father died of pneumonia during a bitter winter. Her mother passed away the following spring. By the time Clara turned 22, she was alone. Most women in her situation would have moved to town, taken work in a boarding house, or married for security. But Clara Whitmore had inherited something from her father that few people possessed: stubborn courage. Instead of leaving, she stayed on the small plot of land her family had claimed. The cabin her father built stood beside a narrow creek, surrounded by open prairie that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Life there was simple, but it required discipline. Clara woke before sunrise most mornings. She fed the chickens, checked the small vegetable garden behind the cabin, and hauled water from the creek. During warmer months, she planted beans, potatoes, and corn. During winter, she spent long evenings mending clothes or reading the small collection of books her mother had brought west. In many ways, she had learned to live like the frontier itself, quiet, patient, and strong. But the prairie also had dangers. Travelers occasionally passed through the area on horseback or in wagons heading toward nearby settlements. Most were decent people simply trying to reach the next town. Yet everyone on the frontier knew that not all riders were honest. Outlaws moved through these lands just as easily as farmers and traders. Some robbed stagecoaches. Others stole horses or disappeared after fights in distant towns. And when trouble came, help was rarely close. That was why Clara kept her father's old revolver hidden in a drawer beside her bed. She had only fired it a handful of times, mostly for practice at tin cans near the creek. Still, just knowing it was there brought comfort. On the evening that would change everything, the sky had turned dark much earlier than usual. By late afternoon, thick storm clouds rolled across the prairie like a wall of shadow. The wind picked up steadily, bending the tall grass and rattling the wooden shutters on Clara's cabin. Storms were common on the frontier, but this one felt different. The air carried a strange heaviness, the kind that made the land feel restless. Clara finished feeding the chickens and secured the small shed behind the cabin before the rain began. The first drops fell slowly, tapping against the roof like scattered pebbles. Within minutes, the storm exploded. Thunder cracked across the prairie, loud enough to shake the windows. Rain came down in sheets, turning the dirt path outside the cabin into thick mud. Clara lit 2 lanterns and set them on the wooden table inside. The warm glow filled the room, pushing back the darkness that pressed against the cabin walls. Storms like this could last hours. Sometimes they lasted all night. Clara tried to continue her usual evening routine. She boiled water on the small iron stove and prepared a simple supper of bread and beans. But the storm made it difficult to focus. Every thunderclap seemed louder than the last. Wind howled across the prairie, forcing its way through small cracks in the cabin walls. The land felt alive with noise. After finishing her meal, Clara wrapped herself in a wool blanket and sat near the table with a book in her hands. The book had belonged to her mother, a collection of stories about explorers and travelers who crossed the continent long before railroads connected the East and West. Normally, Clara enjoyed reading it. Tonight, however, her eyes kept drifting toward the door. Storms had a way of making the frontier feel lonely, and loneliness often made the mind wander to uncomfortable thoughts. What if someone was lost out there in the storm? What if a traveler needed help? Or worse, what if someone dangerous had taken shelter nearby? Clara shook the thoughts from her head. Fear, she had learned, could easily grow out of silence and imagination. The prairie had taught her something important over the years. Most nights passed quietly. Most storms ended without incident. And most worries turned out to be nothing at all. Hours passed slowly. The rain continued, though the thunder began to move farther away across the plains. Clara added more wood to the stove and checked the lanterns again. It was close to midnight when it happened. At first, she thought the sound was part of the storm. A dull thump, then another. Clara froze. She waited, listening carefully. The cabin creaked softly in the wind. Rain tapped against the windows. Then the sound came again. Knock. This time there was no mistaking it. Someone was outside. Clara's heart began to pound. No traveler would normally ride through such a violent storm, especially this far from town. The nearest settlement was nearly 15 miles away, and most riders would have taken shelter long before reaching this part of the prairie. For a moment, Clara considered ignoring the knock entirely. But the sound came again. This time it was louder, more desperate. She slowly stood from her chair. The lantern light flickered as she walked toward the small drawer beside the bed. Clara opened it and carefully lifted her father's revolver. The metal felt cold in her hands. She checked the chamber, just as her father had once taught her. Loaded. Good. Clara walked toward the door. Each step felt heavier than the last. The knocking came again, weaker now, as though whoever stood outside had little strength left. Clara stopped just inches from the door. "Who's there?" she called through the wood. For several seconds, there was only silence. Then a rough voice answered from outside. "Please." Just one word, barely louder than the wind. Clara hesitated. Every instinct on the frontier told people to be careful with strangers. Trust could save lives, but it could also destroy them. Still, that voice had not sounded threatening. It had sounded exhausted. Clara slowly lifted the wooden bar that secured the door. The wind immediately pushed against it as she pulled it open. Cold rain blew into the cabin. And in the doorway, barely standing beneath the storm, was a man. His black hat hung low over his face. His coat was soaked with rain. But what Clara noticed first was the dark stain spreading across his side. Blood. The man tried to take a step forward. Instead, his legs gave out. And before Clara could react, the stranger collapsed directly into her arms. The weight of the stranger nearly pulled Clara to the floor. For a moment she struggled to keep both of them from falling, bracing her shoulder against the doorframe as the man collapsed against her. Rain poured in behind him, carried by the wind. "Easy, easy," Clara murmured, though she wasn't sure if the man could even hear her. He was heavy, but not dead weight. His body twitched slightly as though he were still fighting to remain conscious. Clara dragged him across the threshold and kicked the door shut with her boot. The storm outside continued to roar, but the cabin suddenly felt smaller, quieter, and far more dangerous. She laid the man carefully on the wooden floor beside the table. Lantern light flickered across his face. He looked to be in his early 30s. His jaw was rough with several days' worth of stubble, and long dark hair clung to his forehead from the rain. His breathing was shallow. Clara noticed the gun belt first. A revolver rested in its holster. That alone told her plenty. Most honest travelers carried rifles, sometimes pistols, but the gun belt this man wore looked like it had seen years of use. The leather was cracked and worn smooth from long rides and rough days. Then she saw the wound. A dark stain had spread across the side of his shirt and coat. Blood. A lot of it. Clara's stomach tightened. Gunshot wound. She had seen one once before when a ranch hand passed through town after a fight in a saloon. The town doctor had explained that sometimes the bullet passed clean through, but other times it stayed inside, causing infection that could kill a person slowly. The man stirred. His eyes opened slightly. For a brief moment he looked directly at her. "Water," he whispered. Clara hesitated. Every warning she had ever heard about strangers on the frontier rushed through her mind. What if he was dangerous? What if he woke fully and turned that revolver on her? But then she looked at the wound again. If she did nothing, he would die before morning. And Clara Whitmore was not the kind of person who watched someone die at her door. She quickly poured water from the kettle into a tin cup and knelt beside him. "Drink slowly," she said. The man's hand trembled as he reached for the cup. He barely managed 2 small sips before coughing. Still, a bit of color returned to his face. Clara moved the lantern closer and carefully examined the wound. The bullet had torn through the side of his shirt just below the ribs. Blood soaked the fabric, but she couldn't immediately see whether the bullet had passed through. She needed to clean it. Clara stood quickly and gathered what little medical supplies she had. On the frontier, people learned basic treatment out of necessity. Doctors were often too far away to rely on. Her mother had once taught her how to clean cuts and prevent infection. Boiled water, clean cloth, pressure. Sometimes that was enough to save a life. Clara returned to the man and carefully removed his coat. The wound looked ugly but not fatal. The bullet had passed through his side without hitting anything vital. That was lucky. Very lucky. Still, he had lost a lot of blood. Clara worked carefully, cleaning the wound and wrapping a long strip of cloth around his torso to stop the bleeding. The man groaned slightly as she tightened the bandage. "You'll live," she said quietly. At least, she hoped so. After finishing the bandage, Clara helped him onto the small bed against the wall. He was still weak, barely conscious. For several minutes, she simply watched him breathe. The storm outside had begun to calm. Thunder rolled faintly across the distant hills, and the rain softened into a steady whisper against the roof. The cabin smelled faintly of wet leather and smoke from the stove. Then the man spoke again. "Why help me?" he asked weakly. Clara sat in the chair beside the bed. "Because you knocked," she replied simply. The man gave a tired half-smile. "That's a dangerous reason." Clara folded her arms. "You're not the one living alone on the prairie." For the first time, he seemed to look at her more carefully. "Name's Ethan Cole," he said slowly. Clara studied him. The name sounded familiar, very familiar. She stood abruptly and walked to the small shelf beside the table. A few weeks earlier, a traveling merchant had stopped near her cabin on his way to town. He had mentioned something while sharing coffee. An outlaw, wanted by the law. Someone who had been riding through the territory for months. Clara searched through the papers she kept on the shelf. And there it was. A worn poster the merchant had handed her before leaving. Wanted Ethan Cole suspected in stagecoach robbery near Laramie Reward. $300. Clara felt her chest tighten. $300 was a fortune on the frontier. Enough money to buy land. Enough to change a person's life. She slowly turned back toward the bed. The man lying there, the one she had just saved, was the outlaw on the poster, Ethan Cole. Clara's mind raced. If anyone discovered he was here, she could be accused of harboring a criminal. That was serious, very serious. And yet, something about the situation didn't feel right. Stagecoach robbers usually traveled in groups. They were loud, reckless men who spent stolen money in saloons and gambling houses. But this man? He looked more like a tired traveler than a hardened criminal. Ethan noticed her staring. "You found the poster," he said quietly. Clara didn't answer immediately. "Did you rob that stagecoach?" she asked. Ethan took a long breath. "No," Clara raised an eyebrow. "That's what every outlaw says." "True," Ethan admitted. "But the truth's still the truth." Clara crossed the room and sat again. "Then why is the sheriff hunting you?" Ethan stared at the ceiling for a long moment before answering. "Because someone needed a man to blame." The words hung in the air. Outside, the storm had nearly passed. The night had grown strangely quiet. Clara studied him carefully. People on the frontier learned to read faces quickly. Survival often depended on it. Ethan Cole looked exhausted, wounded, and oddly sincere. But trust was dangerous, especially when the law was involved. Clara finally spoke. "If you're innocent," she said slowly, "why run?" Ethan gave a weak smile. "Because the law doesn't always wait for the truth." He turned his head toward the window. "Sheriff Dalton wants someone to hang for that robbery." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. Sheriff Dalton. She had heard that name before too. A hard man. A man who believed strongly in quick justice. The kind of lawman who sometimes decided guilt before hearing the full story. Ethan closed his eyes. "I just needed somewhere to stop the bleeding," he murmured. Clara said nothing, but deep down she knew something already. The moment she opened that door, her life had become tangled with his, and the prairie had a way of turning small decisions into dangerous consequences. Outside, the clouds slowly began to break. The storm was ending, but a far greater storm was already riding toward the cabin. Because somewhere out on the dark prairie, a sheriff was tracking the same outlaw now lying in Clara Whitmore's bed. And by sunrise, he would be knocking on her door. After Ethan finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, Clara remained seated beside the lantern, staring at the wanted poster in her hands. $300. On the frontier, that amount of money could change a life overnight. It could buy land, livestock, supplies, security that most settlers only dreamed about. For someone like Clara, who worked every day just to keep her small homestead running, it was a fortune. She looked back toward the bed. Ethan Cole slept restlessly, his breathing uneven from the pain in his side. Every few minutes he shifted slightly, as though the wound reminded him that his body had limits. Clara folded the poster and placed it back on the shelf. Money had never guided her decisions. Her father had taught her something important when they first arrived on the frontier. "Out here," he once said, staring across the prairie, "people survive because they help each other. The land is too hard for anything else." Still, helping the wrong person could destroy everything. Clara stood and walked to the window. The storm had finally passed. Clouds drifted apart slowly, revealing a pale moon above the prairie. The grass outside glistened with rain, and the creek beside the cabin rushed louder than usual. For a moment, the world seemed peaceful again. But Clara knew better. Trouble often followed wounded men. She checked the revolver in the drawer beside the bed once more before returning to the chair. Time passed slowly. The lantern flame flickered quietly as the hours stretched toward morning. Eventually, Ethan stirred again. His eyes opened slightly. "You still awake?" he asked. Clara didn't look up from the chair. Hard to sleep with an outlaw in the house. Ethan gave a faint chuckle that quickly turned into a painful cough. "Fair point." Clara leaned forward slightly. "If you didn't rob that stagecoach," she said, "then who did?" Ethan took a moment before answering. "There were 3 men involved," he said quietly. "I saw them ride away from the scene before the shooting started." Clara frowned. "You saw them? I was passing through the canyon when it happened." "Then why didn't you tell the sheriff?" Ethan's expression hardened slightly. "I tried." Clara waited. Ethan looked toward the ceiling again. "You ever hear of the Callahan brothers?" Clara nodded slowly. Anyone who lived in the territory knew the name. The Callahans were cattle rustlers who had been causing trouble for years. They were violent men who rarely stayed in one place long enough for the law to catch them. They robbed the stagecoach, Ethan said, took the money, shot one of the guards, and disappeared into the hills. And you? Clara asked. Wrong place at the wrong time. Ethan sighed. When Sheriff Dalton found me near the canyon, I told him exactly what happened. Clara already sensed where the story was going. But he didn't believe you. Ethan shook his head slowly. Sheriff Dalton had been chasing those brothers for months. When he found me near the robbery site with a gun on my belt, he figured his job was already done. Clara crossed her arms. So you ran? Ethan looked directly at her. Wouldn't you? Clara didn't answer immediately. Life on the frontier had taught her that the law was not always perfect. Sheriffs were human just like everyone else. Sometimes they made mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes cost people their lives. Ethan continued. I rode for 2 days trying to reach the railroad town west of here, he said. Thought maybe the marshal there might actually listen. What stopped you? Ethan touched the bandage around his ribs. One of the Callahan brothers. Clara's eyes widened slightly. They found you? Yesterday afternoon, Ethan said. Near the river crossing. What happened? They didn't want any witnesses. Clara understood. If Ethan told the truth about the robbery, the Callahan brothers could hang for it. So they shot you, she said. Ethan nodded. I managed to ride away before they finished the job. Clara leaned back in her chair, thinking carefully. The story sounded possible. The Callahans were exactly the kind of men who would commit a robbery like that. Still, there was one problem. Sheriff Dalton is still hunting you, she said. Ethan gave a small smile. Which means he'll probably pass through this area by morning. Clara felt a cold weight settle in her chest. Morning. That was only a few hours away. If the sheriff found Ethan here, there would be serious consequences. Harboring a wanted outlaw was a crime, even if the outlaw claimed to be innocent. Clara stood and walked to the stove, adding another piece of wood. The fire crackled softly as flames returned. You should leave before sunrise, she said. Ethan tried to sit up but quickly winced in pain. I'm not riding anywhere tonight. Clara knew he was right. The wound alone would make riding difficult. But the rain had also turned the prairie roads into mud. Even a healthy horse would struggle. Silence filled the cabin again. Finally, Ethan spoke. You could turn me in. Clara looked at him sharply. You'd get the reward, he continued. $300. Clara didn't respond. That kind of money could buy a lot of things, Ethan added. Clara stared at him for a long moment before speaking. Money doesn't fix everything. Ethan seemed almost surprised by the answer. Most people out here would disagree. Most people out here aren't my father, Clara said quietly. Ethan said nothing. The night continued moving slowly toward morning. Eventually, Ethan drifted back into sleep. Clara remained awake. Her thoughts moved between two choices. Turn Ethan over to the sheriff, or trust the story he told. The prairie outside had grown silent again. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. The sound echoed across the open land like a warning. Clara walked to the window again. The eastern horizon showed the faintest hint of gray. Dawn was coming, and with it, the law. She had just turned back toward the bed when something caught her attention. A sound, very faint. Hoofbeats. Clara's heart began to race. At first she wondered if she had imagined it. But then she heard it again. Closer now. A horse approaching through the mud. Ethan's eyes opened immediately. You hear that? He whispered. Clara nodded. Neither of them spoke. The hoofbeats stopped outside the cabin. For a moment there was complete silence. Then, a slow, firm knock echoed through the wood of the door. Clara felt her pulse hammering in her chest. Because deep down, she already knew who it was. The sheriff had arrived. And the sun had barely begun to rise. The knock came again. Slow, confident. Not the desperate pounding of a traveler caught in a storm, but the calm, deliberate knock of a man who expected the door to open. Clara stood frozen in the center of the cabin. Outside, The first light of sunrise stretched across the prairie. Pale gold slipped through the cracks in the wooden shutters, turning the lantern's glow faint and unnecessary. Ethan was already trying to sit up. "Don't," Clara whispered sharply. The movement alone made him grimace with pain. "You can't run," she said quietly. "Not in that condition." Ethan leaned against the wall, breathing slowly through the pain. "Then you better decide what you're going to do." Clara didn't respond. The knock came again. This time the voice followed it. "Miss Whitmore." Clara's blood ran cold. Sheriff Dalton. She had never spoken to him directly before, but she knew the name well enough. Dalton had been the territory's sheriff for nearly 10 years. Some people called him fair. Others called him ruthless. Either way, he had a reputation for getting the job done. Ethan's eyes widened slightly. "He knows your name?" Clara nodded slowly. "Lawmen usually keep track of people living alone out here." Dalton knocked once more. "Miss Whitmore," the sheriff called through the door. "I know you're awake." Clara took a deep breath. The moment had come. She turned toward Ethan. "Behind the bed," she whispered. Ethan hesitated. "Clara, now." Despite the pain, Ethan forced himself off the mattress and slipped behind the narrow space between the bed and the wall. From the door, the shadow there would hide him, at least for a few moments. Clara grabbed the revolver from the drawer and quietly slipped it into her apron pocket. Not to use, just in case. Then she walked slowly to the door. Every step felt louder than the last. Outside, a horse shifted its weight in the mud. Clara lifted the wooden bar and opened the door. Sheriff Dalton stood on the porch. He was exactly how Clara imagined. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a weathered face that looked carved from stone. His tan hat cast a shadow over his eyes, and a silver badge gleamed on the front of his long coat. Behind him, his horse snorted softly in the cool morning air. Dalton studied her calmly. "Morning, Miss Whitmore." Clara nodded politely. "Sheriff." Dalton's gaze moved past her shoulder for the briefest moment, scanning the cabin interior. Then his eyes returned to her. "Mind if I ask you a question?" Clara kept her voice steady. "That depends on the question." Dalton allowed himself the faintest smile. "Fair enough." He rested one hand casually on his belt. "I've been tracking a man through this territory since yesterday afternoon." Clara said nothing. Dalton continued. "His name is Ethan Cole." Inside the cabin, Ethan held his breath. Dalton's eyes studied Clara's face carefully. "You seen anyone riding through here last night?" Clara forced herself to remain calm. "Sheriff," she said evenly, "did you see the storm we had?" Dalton glanced briefly at the muddy prairie. "Hard to miss. No one in their right mind would ride through that," Clara said. Dalton considered the answer. Then he nodded slowly. "True enough." For a moment, it seemed as though he might simply tip his hat and leave. But instead, Dalton stepped forward slightly. "Mind if I come in for a minute?" Clara felt her pulse jump. Behind her, hidden in the shadows, Ethan could hear every word. "Why?" Clara asked. Dalton's expression didn't change. "Because the trail I've been following ends about 50 yards from this cabin." The air between them felt suddenly heavy. Clara knew exactly what that meant. The sheriff had tracked Ethan here. Dalton leaned slightly against the doorframe. "Truth is," he said calmly, "I already know Ethan Cole came this way." Silence stretched between them. Clara forced herself not to look back inside. Dalton's voice lowered slightly. "So I'll ask again. Did you see him?" Clara felt the weight of the moment pressing against her chest. This was the point where everything could change. If she said yes, Dalton would arrest Ethan immediately. If she lied, she could be charged with helping a fugitive. Dalton seemed to read the hesitation in her eyes. "Miss Whitmore," he said quietly, "I'm not here to cause trouble for you." Clara met his gaze. "Then why are you here?" Dalton's expression hardened slightly. "Because a stagecoach guard was killed last week." Clara's stomach tightened. Dalton continued. "And the man responsible needs to face justice." Behind the bed, Ethan clenched his fists. Clara spoke carefully. You're certain Ethan Cole did it? Dalton didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied her again. Let me ask you something, the sheriff said. Have you ever known a guilty man to ride through a thunderstorm with a bullet in his side? Clara blinked. The question surprised her. Dalton sighed quietly. I've been a lawman a long time, Miss Whitmore. His voice carried the tired weight of experience. And I've learned something about criminals. Clara waited. Dalton looked out toward the prairie for a moment before finishing his sentence. They usually run together. His eyes returned to her. But Ethan Cole? He's been running alone. Inside the cabin, Ethan slowly lifted his head. Dalton spoke again. Which makes me wonder something. Clara felt her breath catch. What? She asked. Dalton looked directly into her eyes. Why would an outlaw ride straight into a storm? Unless someone else was chasing him? The question hung in the air. For the first time since arriving, Dalton looked genuinely thoughtful. Truth is, he said quietly, I'm starting to think Ethan Cole might not be the man I'm really looking for. Behind the bed, Ethan closed his eyes. Dalton shifted his weight slightly. So here's what I'm going to do. Clara's heart pounded. I'm going to step inside, Dalton said calmly, and take a look around. The sheriff placed one hand lightly against the door. Not threatening, but firm. Just to be sure. Clara knew there was no stopping him now. If Dalton walked inside, he would find Ethan within seconds. And when that happened, everything would finally come to light. The truth, the lies, and the real danger still riding somewhere across the prairie. Sheriff Dalton stepped into the cabin slowly. Not like a man expecting a fight, but like someone who already understood the situation. His boots left dark prints on the wooden floor as mud from the prairie clung to the soles. Clara closed the door behind him. The cabin suddenly felt smaller than ever. Dalton removed his hat and glanced around the room. The table, the stove, the lantern. Then his eyes moved toward the bed. He stopped. For a long moment, the sheriff said nothing. Clara felt the silence tighten around her chest. Dalton's voice finally broke it. You can come out now, son. Behind the bed, Ethan didn't move. Dalton sighed. You're bleeding on Miss Whitmore's floor. A slow breath escaped Ethan as he realized something important. The sheriff already knew. There was no point hiding anymore. Carefully, despite the pain in his side, Ethan stepped out from the shadows. Clara watched both men closely. This was the moment she had been fearing all night. Dalton studied Ethan for several seconds. His eyes moved to the bandage around Ethan's ribs. Looks like someone did a decent job patching you up. Clara spoke before Ethan could. He would have died otherwise. Dalton nodded once. I believe that. Ethan leaned slightly against the wall. If you're here to take me in, Sheriff, he said calmly, let's just get it done. Dalton didn't move. Instead, he walked to the table and set his hat down. You know, he said thoughtfully, I've been chasing men across this territory for almost 15 years. Neither Clara nor Ethan interrupted. Dalton continued. And one thing I've learned is that guilty men usually behave a certain way. He glanced at Ethan again. They lie badly. Ethan frowned slightly. Dalton folded his arms. When I found you near that canyon 2 days ago, you didn't run at first. Ethan remembered. That's because I tried to tell you what happened. Dalton nodded. Exactly. Clara's eyes moved between the two men. Dalton continued speaking slowly, as if laying pieces of a puzzle on the table. You told me the Callahan brothers robbed the stagecoach. Ethan's voice tightened. They did. Dalton walked toward the window, staring out at the prairie. And I didn't believe you. Clara raised an eyebrow. You just admitted that. Dalton gave a small shrug. I'm not too proud to admit when I'm wrong. Ethan stared at him. So why chase me all the way out here? Dalton turned back toward them. Because I needed to be sure. Clara frowned. Sure about what? Dalton walked to the stove and rested one hand on the wooden counter. After you rode off, he said to Ethan, I went back to the robbery site. Ethan's attention sharpened. And? Dalton's expression hardened. And I found something I should have noticed the first time. Clara leaned forward slightly. What was it? Dalton answered with a single word. Horses. Ethan's brow furrowed. There were 3 sets of tracks leaving the canyon, Dalton explained. 3 horses riding hard into the hills. He looked directly at Ethan. But your horse tracks were different. Ethan understood immediately. I was chasing them. Dalton nodded slowly. That's what it looked like. Silence filled the cabin. Clara felt the pieces beginning to fall together. So you realized he might be telling the truth. Dalton rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. Maybe. Ethan laughed bitterly. And instead of asking questions, you kept hunting me. Dalton's voice grew firm. Because if I was wrong, and you were actually guilty, I couldn't afford to let you disappear. Ethan couldn't argue with that. Out on the frontier, justice sometimes moved slowly, but criminals moved fast. Clara crossed her arms. So what happens now? Dalton looked at Ethan. That depends. Ethan waited. Dalton spoke carefully. You said the Callahans shot you. They did. When? Yesterday afternoon. Dalton nodded. That fits. Clara noticed something shift in the sheriff's expression. Something serious. What aren't you telling us? She asked. Dalton looked at her. The Callahan brothers are still nearby. Ethan straightened slightly despite the pain. How do you know? Dalton pointed toward the prairie outside. Because their tracks split from yours about 5 miles west of here. Clara felt a chill run through her. They're in this area? Dalton nodded once. And if they realize you survived? He looked directly at Ethan. They'll come back to finish the job. The realization settled heavily over the cabin. Ethan clenched his jaw. They won't stop, he said quietly. Clara looked at Dalton. So you're not here to arrest him? Dalton picked up his hat from the table. No, Ethan blinked in disbelief. Then why are you here? Dalton placed the hat back on his head. Because right now, Ethan Cole is the only witness who can prove the Callahan brothers committed that robbery. Clara finally understood. You need him. Dalton nodded. And the Callahans need him dead. The sheriff walked toward the door. I plan to bring you in alive, he told Ethan. But now we have a bigger problem. Ethan looked at him carefully. What problem? Dalton opened the door slightly and glanced toward the prairie. Then he spoke the words that made Clara's stomach drop. They're already coming. Clara rushed to the window. In the distance, barely visible against the rising morning sun, 3 riders were moving across the prairie. Fast, straight toward the cabin. Ethan's voice was quiet but certain. The Callahans. Dalton rested one hand on his revolver. Well, he said calmly. Looks like we're going to settle this the hard way. Clara felt the same thought echo through her mind. The storm from the night before had ended. But a far more dangerous storm was about to begin. And this one carried guns. The 3 riders were still distant, but they were coming fast. Clara could see them clearly now through the cabin window. Dark figures cutting across the wet prairie, their horses kicking up mud from the storm-soaked ground. They weren't trying to hide. They were riding straight toward the cabin. Ethan's voice was low. They know I'm here. Sheriff Dalton rested his hand calmly on the handle of his revolver. Most likely. Clara felt the same fear she had felt the night before. But this time it wasn't uncertainty. It was reality. 3 armed men were riding toward her home. Dalton stepped away from the window and began speaking with the steady tone of a man used to dangerous situations. Miss Whitmore, you got a rifle? Clara nodded. Above the fireplace. Dalton grabbed it quickly and checked the chamber. Good. He handed it to her. You know how to use it? Clara took the rifle without hesitation. My father made sure of that. Dalton gave a short nod of approval. Then we're going to need your help. Ethan tried to stand straighter despite the pain in his side. I can still shoot. Dalton glanced at the bandage. You can still stand? Barely. That'll have to do. The sheriff walked to the table and quickly began planning. 3 riders, he said. Probably the Callahan brothers and 1 extra hand. Ethan nodded. They usually ride with a man named Briggs. Dalton smirked faintly. For criminals with one brain between them. Clara tightened her grip on the rifle. What's the plan? Dalton walked to the door again and studied the land. The prairie offered little cover. But the cabin itself could be defended. They'll try to rush the place, Dalton said. Outlaws like them prefer quick fights. Ethan moved slowly toward the window on the far side of the room. If they realize you're here, Sheriff, he said, they might run. Dalton shook his head. Not these men. He pointed toward Ethan. You're worth more to them dead than alive. Clara's heart beat faster. The riders were closer now. She could see their hats, their coats, and the rifles slung across their backs. Dalton's voice remained calm. Clara, stay near the back window. If they circle the cabin, you'll see them first. She nodded. Ethan, you take the front. Ethan leaned against the wall near the door, revolver ready. Dalton stood beside him. The cabin fell silent. Outside, the thunder of hooves grew louder. Then the riders slowed. About 50 yards from the cabin. One of them raised a hand. They stopped. For several seconds, no one moved. Then the man in front called out, Ethan Cole. His voice carried easily across the open prairie. Ethan's jaw tightened. That's Frank Callahan. The man continued. We know you're in there. Dalton muttered quietly. Of course they do. The outlaw spoke again. You can come out easy, or we burn the place down. Clara felt anger rise in her chest. This was her home. Dalton stepped slightly into the doorway. His voice carried across the prairie. Frank Callahan. The riders shifted in surprise. Well now, Frank called back. Sheriff Dalton. Dalton rested his hand on his revolver. You boys are a long way from wherever you were headed. Frank laughed. Just finishing unfinished business. His eyes drifted toward the cabin windows. You planning to hand over our friend in there? Dalton shook his head slowly. Not today. Frank leaned forward in his saddle. That's unfortunate. The outlaw reached behind his saddle and pulled out a rifle. Dalton's voice grew sharp. You fire that gun, Frank, and this ends badly for you. Frank's smile widened. Sheriff. Everything already ended badly. The rifle lifted. But before Frank could fire, Dalton moved. The sheriff's revolver cracked through the morning air. Frank's hat flew off as the bullet grazed his shoulder. The other riders reacted instantly. Gunfire exploded across the prairie. Clara ducked slightly and aimed the rifle through the window. Her father's lessons echoed in her mind. Breathe. I'm steady. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked against her shoulder. One of the riders cried out and tumbled from his horse. Ethan fired next. His revolver thundered twice. Another outlaw ducked behind his horse for cover. The prairie erupted with chaos. Bullets struck the cabin walls, splintering wood. Dalton stepped forward calmly, firing with precise control. His experience showed in every movement. Within seconds, the fight began turning. One of the Callahans tried to circle behind the cabin. Clara spotted him immediately. She aimed again. The rifle cracked. The outlaw's horse bolted as the rider fell into the grass. Only Frank Callahan remained. The outlaw looked around quickly. His men were down. Dalton's revolver aimed directly at him. Frank slowly lowered his rifle. Well, he muttered. Dalton stepped closer. Looks like your luck finally ran out. Frank glanced toward Ethan. You really going to testify? Ethan met his gaze. Yes. Frank sighed. Should have finished the job yesterday. Dalton holstered his revolver. You should have chosen a different life. The sheriff dismounted Frank and secured his hands. The prairie grew quiet again. The entire fight had lasted less than 2 minutes. Clara slowly lowered the rifle. Her hands trembled slightly as the adrenaline faded. Ethan leaned against the wall, breathing heavily. Dalton returned to the cabin doorway. Everyone still alive? Clara nodded. Barely. Ethan managed a tired smile. Guess the storm wasn't the worst thing that happened last night. Dalton chuckled quietly. No, he looked toward Clara. You did good. Clara glanced at the prairie. 3 horses stood riderless in the grass. The danger was over. Ethan walked slowly outside with Dalton. The morning sun had fully risen now, casting warm light across the open land. After a moment, Ethan turned to the sheriff. What happens now? Dalton shrugged slightly. Now we ride back to town. He looked toward Frank Callahan. And we let the court hear the truth. Ethan nodded. Then he turned toward Clara. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Ethan said quietly, "You saved my life." Clara smiled faintly. "You knocked." Ethan laughed softly. "Dangerous reason." Clara crossed her arms. "Maybe." Dalton mounted his horse and secured Frank beside him. He looked back toward Clara. "You ever get tired of living out here alone, Miss Whitmore? There's always room in town for people with courage." Clara looked across the endless prairie. The land her father had loved. The land she had fought to keep. "I think I'll stay," she said. Dalton tipped his hat. "Fair enough." Moments later, the sheriff and Ethan rode away across the prairie. Clara watched until they disappeared over the distant hill. The cabin grew quiet again. The storm had passed. The outlaws were gone. And life on the frontier returned to what it had always been: hard, quiet, and shaped by the choices people made when no one else was watching.